The pull was sudden, vicious, and utterly degrading. Not a gentle nudge, not a polite request whispered across the linen tablecloth, but a hard, brutal yank on my left arm that brought me stumbling out of the high-backed dining chair. The sound of the silverware clattering against the heirloom porcelain was the only immediate disruption to the silence that had fallen over the Thanksgiving table. It was the sound of my dignity breaking. I am Patricia Hayes, 68 years old, and in that split second, I was just a weight, an obstacle being cleared away by a woman 30 years my junior. Brittany, my daughter-in-law, my son Jason's wife, had a grip like steel. She wasn't even looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the empty space where I had just been sitting, the seat of honor, flanking the 20-pound, perfectly roasted turkey. The air was thick with the scent of sage and thyme, rosemary and betrayal. "You are not needed here, Patricia." Her voice was low, cutting, and strangely formal, like a CEO issuing a dismissal. Her smile, aimed at the rest of the gathered family, cousins, aunts, Jason's business partners, was saccharine, a practiced mask of gentle regret. "Go quietly. Go quietly." The phrase struck me harder than the sudden jolt of my hip, grazing the corner of the buffet cabinet as she dragged me past. Go quietly. As if I were a ghost, a nuisance, a piece of faulty machinery to be disposed of without fanfare. In the very home, on the very day, I had curated for the past 3 decades. I looked at my son, Jason. His plate was full, overflowing with creamy mashed potatoes and glazed carrots. He was staring intensely at the wishbone on the turkey, his hands resting in his lap. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even lift his eyes. That calculated, devastating silence, that was the second, more profound shock. The physical pain from Brittany's rough handling was fleeting. Jason's deliberate indifference was a poison that began to spread instantly through my veins. 30 years. 30 years I had lived in this house, nurtured this family, built this life. And now, on the most American of holidays, the day devoted to gratitude, I was being physically evicted from my own table by my daughter-in-law, with my son's silent, damning consent. The heat rushed to my face. Not shame, not yet. It was a searing, incandescent realization. The familial connection, the one thing I had truly believed was inviolable, was dead. It had been systematically, clinically murdered by greed and convenience. My pain, the one thing Brittany couldn't control, was what mattered now. But a switch flipped inside me, an old circuit inherited from my father, a man who survived the Great Depression by focusing only on the numbers. The love died here, but the contract remains. I stopped struggling. I let my body go limp, forcing Brittany to bear my full weight, momentarily throwing her off balance. Her perfect smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine annoyance. I pulled my arm out of her grasp with a sudden, sharp twist of my wrist. I didn't say a word. I straightened my blazer, a tailored, expensive piece that Walter had bought me years ago, and looked directly at my son. Jason lifted his eyes then, just for a second. They were cold, empty, a flat, non-committal grey that mirrored the Seattle November sky outside. He didn't meet my gaze. He looked at a point just past my shoulder, towards the empty wall. It was a clear boundary. "Do not cross this line, Mother. This is a business transaction now." I finally spoke, my voice steady, though low, devoid of the tremor of despair I felt trying to take root in my throat. I wouldn't give them the show they wanted. "Fine," I said, directing the single word not at Brittany, but at Jason. It was a statement of acknowledgement, of receipt, a formal severing of the tie. I turned and walked away from the dazzling, brightly lit dining room towards the back entrance, towards the mudroom where my keys and coat lay waiting. Every step I took felt like a betrayal of Walter, my late husband, the man who built this house and this life with me. Walter. He was the pragmatic soul, the corporate lawyer who retired at 55, the one who taught me that emotion was secondary to data and documentation. Patricia, he used to say, stirring his second cup of espresso every morning, the Seattle morning light streaming through the kitchen window. Love is a beautiful accident. The law, however, is a dependable structure. Always protect the structure. How vividly I remembered the last Thanksgiving we had shared, barely 4 years ago. The house was full then too, but full of warmth, not this terrible, brittle tension. Walter, his face flushed with the effort of carving the turkey, a task he secretly despised but performed with theatrical flair, had looked across the table at Jason. "You know, son," Walter had boomed, his voice always just a little too loud for indoor settings, "your mother is the heart of this operation. She's the reason this house is a home and not just an asset. Don't ever forget that." Jason had smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile, the one that still held a trace of the boy who used to cling to my hand on the first day of school. "Never, Dad," he'd promised. Never. A promise that had lasted precisely 4 years, 11 months, and 28 days. I found my heavy wool coat draped over the bench in the mudroom. I fumbled for my keys in the deep pocket, my fingers surprisingly numb. The cold wasn't outside. It was radiating from the center of my chest. I looked at the house telephone mounted on the wall. I didn't dial 911. My immediate, trained instinct, honed by decades of being married to a corporate attorney and managing our philanthropic foundation, wasn't to call for emotional rescue or medical help. My first thought was logistical, strategic. I pulled out my cell phone, the one I kept charged in my purse, and walked out the back door into the biting November air. The sky was the color of slate. The air smelled of damp earth and coming rain. I walked down the stone path towards the detached garage where I kept my car. I didn't look back at the brightly lit windows, the promise of warmth and laughter that had just been violently snatched away from me. I pressed the speed dial button labeled Elias Thorne, Escritor. Elias Thorne was Walter's protege, the man who handled our private legal affairs. He was meticulous, clinical, and immune to sentimentality, exactly what I needed right now. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. "Elias Thorne speaking." "Elias, it's Patricia. Happy Thanksgiving." The greeting felt absurd, but habit is a terrible master. "Patricia, a pleasure. I trust the turkey is suitably dry," he joked gently. "It is," I replied, my voice flat. "But the relationship is now officially fractured, irreparably. I need to activate the contingency plan we discussed immediately." The humor left his voice immediately. Elias knew exactly what I meant. Walter, in his infinite foresight, or perhaps his deep-seated understanding of human nature, had drafted a comprehensive set of legal instruments regarding my protection, the house, and the foundation's assets, precisely for this eventuality. He always understood that blood ties were a poor substitute for legal structure when large sums of money were involved. "Today, Patricia? Thanksgiving?" Elias asked, not out of complaint, but out of surprise. "Today. It happened less than 5 minutes ago. I was physically escorted out of my own dining room by Brittany, with Jason's full and silent support, in front of the entire family. It was a clear act of elder abuse, emotional and, arguably, physical battery and trespassing given the circumstances and the property rights. I am sitting in my car now, Elias." I need to change my status from a grieving victim to a legally protected plaintiff. Now. There was a brief pause. I could almost hear the rustling of his thoughts, the mental turning of pages in the immense law library that was his brain. Understood, Patricia. That changes things from a preventative stance to an active one. Your immediate action needs to be documentation. Did you witness anyone else seeing the incident? Any third parties? The other guests? They saw. They were silent. They are all complicit, or at least terrified of offending Jason and Brittany's influence. Fine. That's ancillary. The house itself is still solely in your name, held in trust. Correct? Correct. Per the terms of Walter's will, Jason receives the bulk of the non-liquid assets only upon my demise, contingent on my full cognitive capacity until that time, which is confirmed annually by Dr. Peterson. Walter had made sure I was protected. Jason was always eager. Excellent. The Trust Agreement's Article 5, Section B, regarding intentional infliction of severe emotional distress or physical harm upon the beneficiary by any heir, now comes into play. I am initiating the emergency temporary restraining order process immediately. I will file the initial paperwork within the hour. You need to drive directly to a location where you can be alone and stable. Do you have access to the safe deposit boxes? The boxes are secured, and I have already arranged for a rental apartment in Belltown. I made the arrangement 3 months ago just in case. It's fully furnished, discreet, and booked for 6 months. I am driving there now. Elias chuckled, a dry, approving sound. You never cease to amaze me, Patricia. Walter taught you well. Go there. Once you are settled, email me a detailed timeline of the events preceding today. Do not minimize the severity of Brittany's actions or Jason's complicity. We need to frame this as an unambiguous act of hostile takeover and abuse of a senior citizen on their own property. Remember, we are not looking for revenge. We are looking for justice. And more importantly, protection of your autonomy and property rights. I understand, Elias. Justice, not revenge. Structure, not sentiment. I took a deep breath. My hands were finally steady on the steering wheel. The emotional storm hadn't passed, but the sheer effort of the logistical planning had created a necessary barrier, a pragmatic shield. One more thing, Patricia. The long game. Walter always wanted this estate to do some good. This situation, while devastating, gives us the perfect public platform to establish the Hayes Autonomy Foundation, a non-profit designed to provide legal aid and financial support to seniors facing exactly this kind of exploitation from their own families. Think of the tax implications, the legacy, the community benefit. We can use this trauma as the seed for something indestructible. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The cold, pragmatic genius of it, the transformation of personal grief into a structured, beneficial community resource, was Walter's ultimate gift to me, even now. It gave the pain a purpose, turned the betrayal into a data point, a case study. My eyes stung, but I knew it wasn't sadness. It was the sudden, overwhelming clarity of mission. Yes, Elias. We begin the work on the foundation immediately. This will be the legacy. Tell me what paperwork you need. I will have it digitally signed before midnight. I hung up the phone. The engine of my SUV hummed to life, a steady, dependable sound. I pulled out of the garage, the automatic door closing softly behind me, sealing off the home that had, 5 minutes ago, become a hostile zone. I drove out of the pristine, leafy neighborhood of Queen Anne, heading towards the bright lights and concrete geometry of downtown Seattle. The city was my true home. The suburban enclave had always been Walter's ideal. Now the city's objective chaos felt more comforting than the silent, controlled cruelty of my own family. My mind started to churn, not with why, but with how. How had I missed the signs? Jason had been subtle, his withdrawal disguised as the pressure of his financial career. The missed lunches, the brief, distracted phone calls, the way he increasingly deferred to Brittany on every major family decision. It had started small. The passive-aggressive comments from Brittany about the house being too big for just one person, the not-so-subtle inquiries about the contents of Walter's will. I remembered a conversation from 6 months ago. We were having dinner at a trendy new restaurant. My treat, of course. "Mum," Jason had said, not looking up from his phone, "the maintenance on the Queen Anne place is staggering. The property taxes alone, they are almost $70,000 a year now. Why not just sell? You could downsize, live comfortably in a condo, and free up the bulk of the equity. It would simplify things considerably." I had smiled then, a small, knowing smile Walter had taught me. "It simplifies things for whom, Jason? The house is already fully paid for, and the property taxes are a fraction of the income generated by the trust's investments. The house isn't a burden, dear. It's an asset, and it is my home." Brittany had jumped in, her voice too bright. "Oh, of course, Patricia. But think of the freedom. You could travel, see the world. You don't want to be tied down by a 9,000 square foot house at your age." My age. The silent suggestion. You're old, you're weak, you're losing your grip. I had deflected them then, citing the importance of keeping the house as the registered office for the fledgling charitable foundation Walter and I had planned. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. They wanted me to relinquish the asset, and now the house itself would be the centerpiece of the very foundation but they hoped to dismantle. The physical act of Brittany's pull, the sheer audacity of laying hands on me, had been the clarifying moment. It wasn't about simplifying my life, it was about decommissioning my life. They needed me gone, quietly, discreetly, so the inheritance could be accelerated and leveraged. My focus shifted back to the present, to the facts needed for Elias's timeline. Fact 1. The trigger. Today, Thanksgiving, 4:15 p.m. Brittany Hayes, physically assaulted, removed me from the dining table, witnessed by approximately 20 family members and guests. Fact 2. The intent. Brittany's verbal statement. "You are not needed here. Go quietly." This clearly establishes intent to humiliate and eject me from my legal residence. Fact 3. Complicity. Jason Hayes's deliberate silence and refusal to intervene establishes his consent to the assault and abuse. Fact 4. Precedent. 6 months of escalating documented pressure to sell the property and inquire about trust assets. I realized I wasn't grieving the loss of my son. I was mourning the death of a 30-year investment. I had invested every fiber of my being into raising Jason after his biological mother, Vanessa, decided motherhood was less interesting than a career in global finance. Vanessa, who had simply walked out when Jason was 5, leaving a note that said, "He needs stability, not drama. You're better at the structure, Patricia." Structure. That was my core competency. I provided the structure, the stability, the emotional architecture of a home, while Walter provided the financial framework. We built Jason's life brick by emotional brick, replacing the gaping hole left by Vanessa's departure with unconditional, practical love. I remembered Jason's 5th birthday. He had just started kindergarten, and the abandonment was still fresh, manifesting in terrible night terrors. I had stayed up all night, assembling a complex 900-piece train set, one that Walter had insisted was too advanced for a 5-year-old. I finished it as the sun rose, placing it perfectly on the floor of his bedroom. When he woke up and saw it, his face lit up. He ran and hugged me, a tight, earnest hug. "Thank you, Mummy," he'd whispered, using the name he had chosen for me. Not Patricia, not stepmom. Mummy, that 5-year-old boy, that memory was the real tragedy. That boy was gone, replaced by the silent, $50,000 suit sitting at the Thanksgiving table, more concerned with the texture of his gravy than the violent humiliation of the woman who raised him. The practical side of me, the side Walter loved and cultivated, took over. Tears were a luxury I couldn't afford. The immediate objective was to secure my position, leverage the law, and start the administrative work on the foundation. I pulled up to the Belltown apartment building. It was modern, sleek, and utterly impersonal. Perfect. The doorman, whom I had tipped generously 3 months ago, greeted me discreetly. "Welcome back, Mrs. Hayes. Everything is ready in the penthouse." The penthouse. Another practical decision. I couldn't risk staying in a hotel where Jason or Brittany might find me. This place was expensive, registered under an LLC, and offered anonymity. I stepped into the apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of Puget Sound. The water was dark, choppy, and vast. I stood there, looking out at the immensity of the world outside the narrow confines of my family tragedy. I pulled out my laptop and began typing the timeline for Elias. The words flowed easily, coldly, efficiently. I described the dining room, the position of the guests, the sound of the clatter, Brittany's grip, Jason's empty eyes. I documented everything, transforming the raw, aching wound into a legal document, a testimony. The process of writing was cathartic in its rigor. It forced me to analyze, not feel. I was building a case, not writing a diary. This was not a plea for sympathy. It was a demand for justice. Walter's voice echoed in my mind. "Always control the narrative, Patricia. The law favors clarity and evidence, not tears." I finished the document, formatted it precisely, and attached the scanned copies of the relevant trust articles that Walter had instructed me to keep in a digital vault. I sent the email to Elias Thorne at 7:00 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. Subject: Case Activation, Hayes Trust, Article 5B. Content: Dear Elias, attached. Please find the detailed timeline and supporting documentation for the initiation of the TRO and subsequent legal action. I am now fully separated from the property and my son's influence. I am ready to proceed with the full extent of the protective measures we discussed, including the immediate public launch of the Hayes Autonomy Foundation. Thank you for your swift action. Patricia Hayes. Sending that email felt like signing the final divorce papers. The divorce from my son. I closed the laptop and walked into the small, sophisticated kitchen. I opened the refrigerator. It was stocked, per my instructions 3 months ago, with necessities: organic milk, high-quality dark chocolate, and a bottle of a very good, very dry Sauvignon Blanc. I poured myself a glass of wine. I didn't drink it immediately. I held the chilled glass in my hand, savoring the feeling of the cold glass against my warm palm. I walked back to the window. The city lights were brilliant, defiant against the darkness. I thought about the house on Queen Anne Hill, the turkey getting cold on the table, the awkward, forced conversation that must be taking place now that the problem had been forcibly removed. I didn't miss them. I missed the idea of them. I missed the boy and the husband who were no longer there. My priority now was not retrospective grief, but future-forward action. The foundation, the Hayes Autonomy Foundation. Its mission statement would be simple: to provide legal and psychological resources for senior citizens who have been victims of financial or emotional exploitation by their own adult children, enabling them to reclaim their dignity and economic independence. It was a perfectly American mission, practical, structured, focused on individual rights and self-reliance. It would turn Jason and Brittany's attempted act of destruction into a platform for construction. It would be my new life's work, my legacy, independent of the one I had shared with Walter. I lifted the glass to my lips. It was crisp, clean, and bracing. The phone rang. It was Elias. Patricia, I've read the timeline. It's concise and damning. The temporary restraining order is being filed electronically now. The court will issue it within the hour. No one, not Jason, not Brittany, is allowed within 500 feet of your new residence. More importantly, we are attaching an injunction preventing them from liquidating any major assets of the Hayes Trust or taking out any loans against the Queen Anne property. They are frozen, Patricia, completely. Their attempt to accelerate the inheritance has just put the entire estate into escrow. They won't be able to touch a single major asset until this is settled. A sense of powerful, icy calm settled over me. The trap had sprung. They had walked right into the legal framework Walter and I had so carefully constructed. Their impatience had cost them everything, at least temporarily. Excellent, Elias. I will be in your office at 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow, Friday, for the strategic meeting. I want to discuss the initial public relations strategy for the foundation launch. We need to control the narrative before they can spin this as a confused old woman story. Understood. We'll use the official legal filings, the documented abuse, to launch the foundation. The personal tragedy becomes the raison d'etre. It's brilliant, Patricia. It's what Walter would have done. I hung up the phone for the second time, and the cold feeling began to recede, replaced by a fierce, focused energy. I looked out at the city, now not as a refuge, but as a vast field of opportunity. I was alone, yes, but I was also autonomous. I had been stripped of the emotional tie that bound me, but in doing so, I had regained the freedom to act, to build, to define my own final chapter. The humiliation of the dining room had been the brutal price of my freedom. I wasn't a victim, I was a plaintiff. I wasn't just grieving, I was strategizing. I wasn't discarded, I was relocating. I looked down at my hand. My wrist was slightly bruised where Brittany had grabbed me. I touched the mark, not with sorrow, but with the objectivity of a scientist examining a sample. It was evidence, physical proof of the cost of my autonomy. I would take that pain, that violation, and I would structure it into a shield for others. I would use the tools I had, my legal knowledge, my financial standing, my American-trained sense of individualism and justice, to turn my personal crisis into a public benefit. I picked up the remote and turned on the television. The news was on, showing cheerful clips of families gathering for Thanksgiving. I watched it without emotion, recognizing the scene as a beautiful, comforting fiction that was no longer mine. My reality was sharper, colder, and more real. I thought of Jason and Brittany, likely staring at the injunction papers Elias would have delivered by now. The papers that confirmed their greed had backfired spectacularly. I felt a surge of something that wasn't exactly satisfaction, but a deep, quiet sense of equilibrium restored. The justice of the contract. I sat down on the leather sofa, the crisp air from the sound view refreshing. I was physically and legally safe. I was financially secure. My mind was sharp. The foundation awaited. I was not needed at their table, but I was necessary for my own future. That thought was the final defining pivot of the day. I spent the rest of the evening reading the preliminary documents for the Hayes Autonomy Foundation, drafting the public statement, outlining the grant requirements. The feeling of constructing something meaningful was the most potent antidote to the emotional poison I had ingested earlier. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was now compartmentalized, categorized, and assigned a purpose. It was the fuel. I had become the architect of my own recovery, a pragmatic American woman who understood that when emotion fails, structure prevails. The first part of my journey, the painful collapse and the rapid strategic pivot, was complete. I was no longer the old woman who was dragged from her chair. I was the founder, the plaintiff, the protected sovereign of her own life and destiny. The work was just beginning, but I was ready. I was not going to go quietly. I was going to go with a full legal team, a public relations strategy, and a mission that would outlive the memory of their cruel Thanksgiving. The window view was still vast, but the choppy darkness of the sound had given way to the soft, diffused grey light of a Seattle morning. I hadn't slept, not truly. I had merely paused my consciousness, holding the immense grief and the sudden clinical rage in a careful, dry-eyed equilibrium. The bruise on my wrist felt like a brand, a permanent reminder of Brittany's trespass, but it was also a badge of my new reality. The era of sentimentality was over. I showered, dressed in a sharp navy suit, my armor for the legal battlefield, and applied a meticulous layer of makeup. My hands, which had trembled when Brittany had grabbed me, were now steady as I fastened the gold brooch Walter had given me on our 25th anniversary. It wasn't about looking good. It was about presenting an unassailable front of competence and control. The American legal system favors clarity, strength, and unwavering self-possession. I was going to embody all three. I left the apartment at precisely 7:30, a habit of punctuality ingrained by Walter. Elias Thorne's office was located in the financial district, a towering fortress of glass and steel. As I walked into the hushed, minimalist reception area, I felt a strange sense of returning home. This was my native language: strategy, negotiation, and contract law. Elias was waiting for me in the conference room. He was a lean, sharp man in his early 50s, with the kind of reserved demeanor that inspires confidence. He rose as I entered, but his eyes were purely professional, assessing. "Patricia, you look resolved," he said, pulling out a chair for me. "I am, Elias, resolved to protect my autonomy and to proceed with the highest level of efficiency. I have lost a son, but I will not lose my purpose." He nodded, approvingly. He laid a sheaf of documents on the polished mahogany table. "Good. We have achieved maximum legal disruption. The temporary restraining order was granted last night at 10:11 p.m. Jason and Brittany are barred from entering the Queen Anne property, contacting you, or touching any trust assets without a court order. They are, for all intents and purposes, frozen out." He slid a colour photograph across the table. It was a picture of the front door of the Queen Anne house, taped with the official bright orange court order. The visual evidence of the structure I had built, finally defending me. The sheer audacity of Brittany's action on Thanksgiving had allowed Elias to argue for the TRO on the grounds of immediate and ongoing elder abuse, specifically financial exploitation, masked by emotional distress and physical intimidation. I picked up the photo. It was a beautiful shot of the house I had labored over, the house that held the ghost of Walter's laugh. Now it was a crime scene, legally speaking, a tangible barrier between me and the people who sought to erase me. "Did they respond?" I asked. Jason's personal lawyer called me at midnight, sputtering. He demanded to know how we filed a motion on a public holiday. I simply pointed to the photographic evidence of the bruise on your wrist, which I asked you to document immediately. Thank you for that quick thinking. And the fact that the assault happened on Thanksgiving, maximizing the humiliation and distress. I told him we are viewing this not just as a family dispute, but as a felony-level attempt to influence the disposition of a vast estate. He hung up. They are on the defensive, Patricia. They never anticipated you would fight with legal steel. They expected tears and a passive retreat. They mistook pragmatism for weakness, Elias, a common error. My husband's primary lesson to me was that the only thing more dependable than a good lawyer is a well-drafted contract. We will teach them that lesson now. We spent the next 6 hours immersed in strategy. The immediate objective was to solidify the Hayes Autonomy Foundation and use the impending legal battle as its launch platform. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit, it was about converting the entire episode into a public good. The timing is crucial, Elias explained, tapping his pen against a document outlining the foundation's structure. We leak the story of the Thanksgiving incident and the TRO to the press in a controlled manner, perhaps the Seattle Times or a major financial news outlet, as the official launch of the foundation. The headline is not Wealthy Widow Sue's Son, but Philanthropist Launches Foundation to Combat Elder Abuse After Personal Tragedy. The pain becomes the mission statement. The funds? I asked. The foundation will be funded initially by your personal liquid assets, Patricia, the $5 million you've kept separate from the Hayes Trust. We then publicly announce your intention to divest a substantial portion of the Hayes Trust assets into the foundation's endowment. This is the masterstroke. It makes it impossible for Jason and Brittany to argue that they deserve the inheritance, because you are diverting the money into something demonstrably ethical and community-focused. The beauty of the plan was its sheer pragmatism. It not only shielded the wealth from their greed, but repurposed it into an indestructible legacy. It addressed the financial angle, the emotional angle, and the legal angle simultaneously. We worked through the detailed structure, the board of directors, Walter's old, trustworthy colleagues, the funding mechanism, the legal aid outreach programs. It felt like I was giving birth to a massive, complex machine, a machine built out of the remnants of my broken heart. Around noon, as we paused for a brief clinical lunch of salads and sparkling water, the conversation drifted back, inevitably, to Jason. "You understand, Patricia," Elias said, carefully slicing a piece of avocado, "that this process means total and permanent severance. Once you use the legal system to this extent, the personal relationship is irretrievable." The personal relationship died yesterday, Elias. Jason and Brittany simply performed the funeral rites when she dragged me out. What I am performing now is the will reading, and they are not pleased with the terms. I recalled the day Jason was born, 32 years ago. His biological mother, Vanessa, had been glamorous, restless, and completely unsuited for motherhood. I had already been married to Walter for 5 years, and we were struggling with infertility. When Vanessa walked away, leaving 5-year-old Jason sobbing in the hallway, Walter and I stepped in without a second thought. I wasn't a blood relative, but I was the constant, the fixed point. I was the one who learnt to cook his favorite simple foods, who read him Where the Wild Things Are 1,000 times, who taught him how to tie his laces and manage his money. I was the structure he needed. I remembered Jason's 10th birthday, a glorious, sunny Seattle day. We were out sailing on the Sound, Walter teaching him how to manage the lines. Jason had looked up at me, his small face earnest beneath his baseball cap. "Mom," he'd asked, "if Mom Vanessa comes back, will I still get to keep you?" "You will always have me, Jason," I had promised, hugging him tight against the salty air. "Always. That's a promise, not a wish." Now the memory didn't bring tears. It brought a flash of calculating anger. They had banked on that promise, exploiting my lifelong dedication as a weakness. They thought that because I had given my love so freely, I would relinquish my property just as easily. They failed to realize that the love I gave was backed by an equally fierce sense of proprietary justice. I taught Jason self-reliance, structure, and respect for property. They had betrayed every lesson. "The pain, Elias," I said, looking out the window at the dense cityscape, "is not in the loss of Jason. It's in the loss of my belief in my own judgment. I invested 3 decades of emotional capital into a partnership that yielded a negative return. My new purpose is to ensure that my financial capital is invested in a partnership that yields a measurable positive return for the community. It's a pragmatic recalculation." Elias smiled, a rare, genuine expression of respect. "A very American recalculation, Patricia. From personal tragedy to community pillar. We move the first $500,000 into the Foundation's Legal Defense Fund account today. Tomorrow we hold the press conference." The next morning, the air crackled with a different kind of electricity than the night of the assault. The press conference was held in the grand, marbled lobby of Elias's law firm. The backdrop was clean, professional, and serious. I stood at the podium, flanked by Elias and 2 other distinguished members of the newly formed foundation board. I didn't wear black. I wore a soft, elegant, cream-colored suit, a choice of quiet dignity over dramatic grief. The television cameras and reporters were a blur of focused attention. This was my moment to control the narrative. I began by speaking not of the lawsuit, but of the mission. "Today, we are launching the Hayes Autonomy Foundation," I started, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. "Its mission is to provide legal and practical assistance to senior citizens who have been victims of exploitation, abuse, or financial pressure from trusted family members. This foundation is a tribute to my late husband, Walter Hayes, who believed implicitly in the principle of individual self-determination, regardless of age." I paused, letting the statement of purpose sink in. Then I delivered the pivot. "Some of you may have heard whispers about the catalyst for this launch. I will address it directly. This foundation was born out of a profound and recent trauma. On Thanksgiving Day, in my own home, I experienced an act of physical intimidation and emotional abuse designed to force me to relinquish control of my assets. This act was perpetrated by my daughter-in-law, Brittany Hayes, and was tacitly approved by my son, Jason Hayes." The room erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions. I waited patiently, a serene expression fixed on my face, until Elias gently tapped the microphone for silence. "I am not here to air dirty laundry," I continued, cutting through the noise with authority. "I am here to declare that such acts of greed and filial betrayal, will not stand, not in my life, and not in the lives of other seniors. The legal system is our most powerful tool for self-defense. We have filed a temporary restraining order and are pursuing legal action not out of malice, but out of absolute necessity to protect my autonomy, my property, and my right to determine the trajectory of my own legacy." I finished by announcing the initial funding, $5 million, and outlining the specific legal resources the foundation would offer. I took 3 questions, all of which I answered with clinical precision, avoiding any emotional response. I framed the entire crisis as a case study in the urgent need for senior legal protections. When the press conference ended, I felt lighter, cleansed. The weight of the secret, the humiliation of the event, had been lifted by its public, purposeful articulation. It was no longer just my pain. It was the Foundation's founding narrative. Later that afternoon, back in Elias's office, we watched the cable news coverage. My face was on every major network. The story was trending on social media. The narrative was exactly as we had engineered it. Patricia Hayes, the dignified philanthropist, fighting to turn personal pain into a powerful, legally structured community benefit. The phone rang. It was the managing partner of Jason's firm, a desperate man whose career was now in jeopardy due to the massive public relations nightmare Jason had created. Elias took the call in his adjacent office. I could hear the muffled, frantic voice through the wall. When Elias returned, his expression was a mask of cold satisfaction. "They are officially panicked, Patricia. The managing partner says Jason is on administrative leave, and Brittany has been told to stay away from the office. Their lawyer is offering to settle immediately. They want you to drop the elder abuse claim and the public statements in exchange for a clean transfer of the property deeds back to your full, personal control outside the Hayes Trust. They want to minimize the damage to their professional lives." I leaned back in my chair, the sunlight warming my face. I picked up a pen and began idly sketching the outline of the Queen Anne house on a notepad. "Tell them no, Elias. The time for a simple, clean transfer is over. I need more than the property. I need restitution for the emotional and public harm. And I need a mechanism to ensure this never happens again. Their professional humiliation is the price of admission to this negotiation. Their anxiety is our leverage." My mind raced ahead, practical and clear. I knew exactly what I wanted. "I want the Queen Anne house, as you stated, absolutely under my sole ownership, but I also want a significant, non-discretionary lump sum, say $900,000, transferred directly into the Hayes Autonomy Foundation as damages and public interest restitution. Furthermore, I want them to sign a legally binding statement acknowledging their actions constituted elder abuse and intentional infliction of emotional distress, a document that will be sealed by the court but kept on file as a permanent record. They must concede the truth of their actions, not just the financial consequences." Elias stared at me, his respect palpable. "That is aggressive, Patricia. They will never admit to elder abuse publicly." "They don't have to admit it publicly, Elias. They have to admit it legally. They have to put their signature on a document acknowledging the reality of what they did, which is far more devastating to their legal and professional future than any public statement. Tell them they have 24 hours to agree to those terms, or we proceed with the full public lawsuit and the deposition of every single witness at that Thanksgiving table." The ultimatum was pure Walter Hayes, hard, clear, and non-negotiable, focused on documentation and control. I knew what the real cost of their surrender would be. It wouldn't be the $900,000, a paltry sum to them, but a magnificent contribution to the foundation. The real cost was the acknowledgement of abuse and the permanent alienation from my love and future financial support. They would be buying back their professional reputation at the cost of their familial soul. The next few days were a blur of intense negotiation carried out entirely by Elias. I cut off all personal channels of communication. I didn't answer the two pathetic, self-pitying emails Jason managed to send before the court injunction fully blocked him. I maintained a monastic silence, focusing solely on the development of the foundation's infrastructure. I organized the documents for the initial grant applications. I hired a small, dedicated staff. I began to write the foreword for the Foundation's first annual report, transforming the narrative of my assault into an actionable blueprint for others. I reflected on my new life in the Belltown apartment. It was quiet. It was sterile. It was free. I was spending my days constructing a new legacy, not trying to repair a broken one. The sense of absolute self-reliance was intoxicating. I realized that for too long, my identity had been defined by my roles: Walter's wife, Jason's mother. Now, I was Patricia Hayes, founder and principal of a major non-profit. My autonomy was the ultimate victory. The emotional storm of the Thanksgiving incident had been successfully channeled. The immense grief was now encased in the protective steel of the legal structure, providing the energy for the foundation. This was the true nature of pragmatic survival, recognizing that some things are not worth saving, only leveraging. On the third day after the press conference, Elias called me. "It's done, Patricia. They accepted the terms. The paperwork is signed. The deed to the Queen Anne property has been transferred entirely into your sole personal name, outside the trust. And a wire transfer of $900,000 was just confirmed in the Hayes Autonomy Foundation's endowment account." He paused, a hint of awe in his voice. "They also signed the acknowledgement. It is sealed by the court, but it exists. The entire case is now officially dismissed with prejudice. It's over." I closed my eyes. The silence was immense. Not the terrifying, complicit silence of the dining room, but the satisfying, absolute silence of victory. "Thank you, Elias," I said, my voice low. "Please instruct my new property management team to prepare the Queen Anne house for immediate sale. The foundation needs a permanent, visible headquarters, not a trophy home on a hill. We will find a centralized location downtown, a symbol of accessibility and action. The Queen Anne house, the symbol of my familial prison and my heartbreak, was now merely a financial instrument. Its sale would fund the next phase of my mission." I hung up the phone. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I didn't drink the celebratory wine. I needed to remain clear. The legal battle was won, but the lifelong commitment to the foundation was just beginning. The practical work of helping others navigate their own betrayals had replaced the painful, futile work of trying to salvage my own. I was 68 years old, and I was finally, truly, in charge. I had been pulled from a chair by greed, but I had walked away on my own terms, armed with the law, and driven by a practical, unyielding commitment to self-preservation and community impact. The painful, lonely process of rebuilding myself had begun, not with a whimper, but with the solid foundation of a $900,000 endowment. The closure came not as a sudden, dramatic flourish, but as the quiet finality of a closing escrow. It was late March. Spring was fighting its way into Seattle, dusting the grey streets with a tentative green. 4 months had passed since the Thanksgiving table, 4 months of monastic focus, legal maneuvering, and the intense administrative labor of breathing life into the Hayes Autonomy Foundation. The Queen Anne house, the symbol of my life with Walter and the site of my ultimate humiliation, was sold. The sale was swift and clean, fetching exactly what I expected, a testament to the impeccable maintenance I had always insisted upon. The funds were instantly transferred, the bulk of the proceeds earmarked for the foundation's endowment. I felt no sorrow at the parting, only the crisp satisfaction of a strategic transaction completed. It was money converted into purpose. My new headquarters for the foundation was a space I personally selected, a modern, accessible suite of offices on the ground floor of a building in the vibrant downtown core. It was the antithesis of the isolated trophy home on the hill. It was open, welcoming, and situated near legal aid services, a visible symbol of accessibility and action. The first official staff meeting in the new office felt like the true beginning of my life's third act. I sat at the head of a clean maple conference table, looking at the small team I had assembled. Elias Thorne, now serving pro bono as the Foundation's chief legal counsel; Dr. Evelyn Reed, a geriatric psychologist renowned for her work in emotional abuse; and 2 sharp, dedicated young paralegals. "We are not merely a legal aid society," I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the fresh space. "We are an empowerment structure. We take the shock and trauma the very pain that Jason and Brittany inflicted upon me, and we metabolize it into concrete, legal, and therapeutic action for others. Our purpose is to teach resilience and autonomy. We teach them that the law is their shield, not a weapon of revenge. Dr. Reed spoke, her tone calm and insightful. The psychological trauma for the seniors we serve is often compounded by the familial betrayal. They feel shame, Patricia. They feel responsible. We need to teach them what you have mastered, the ability to differentiate the legal facts from the emotional fantasy. You saw the reality. The love died, but the contract remained. That cognitive shift is their path to healing. Her words resonated deeply. It was true. My survival had hinged on the ability to freeze the emotional catastrophe and engage the rational, pragmatic mind. That freeze had allowed me to call Elias, to document the bruise, to initiate the TRO. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation through objectivity. I had not seen Jason or Brittany since that Thanksgiving night, nor had I tried. The sealed court document, the signed acknowledgement of elder abuse and intentional infliction of emotional distress, was my permanent firewall. The $900,000 they transferred as restitution felt less like cash and more like the cost of their severance, the fee for my freedom. The foundation's launch was covered widely. We used the $900,000 to fund the first round of legal grants, specifically targeting complex cases where seniors were being pressured into changing their wills or selling their primary residences. The press loved the narrative. The betrayal of Thanksgiving converted into a force for good. My personal story, once a private agony, was now a public, powerful case study. I became Patricia Hayes, the speaker, the advocate, the strategist. My life, once defined by the quiet domesticity of a large, beautiful home, was now defined by the rigorous, demanding work of philanthropy. The work was demanding, but it was purifying. Each successful case the foundation took on felt like a suture on my own wound. One afternoon, I was giving a public seminar, a masterclass really, in pragmatic self-defense, to a room full of potential donors and concerned family members. I spoke about the necessity of separating one's legacy from one's relationships. Your wealth is not a measure of your love, I advised them, standing tall behind the podium. Your will is not a tool for emotional reward. It is a legal document. Protect your assets, not because you are greedy, but because if you fail to protect your own autonomy, those who seek to exploit you will not hesitate to destroy it. As I spoke, I caught a flicker of movement near the back door. Standing there, shadowed and looking profoundly out of place, was Jason. He was thinner, his expensive suit looked crumpled, and his face was drawn, a portrait of stress and failure. He looked like the boy who used to stand outside my bedroom door after a nightmare, seeking refuge. But I knew better. That boy was gone. This man was a consequence. He stayed for the entire hour-long presentation. He watched me as I detailed the foundation's work, the legal strategies, the meticulous planning. He watched as I told a sanitized version of the Thanksgiving story, a case study of filial exploitation, without ever naming him. He watched me transform the very public disgrace he inflicted into a symbol of competence and resolve. When the session ended, Jason waited until the room was nearly empty before approaching the podium. He stopped several feet away, honoring the spiritual distance between us, if not the physical one. "Mum," he began, his voice rough. It was the first time I had heard him speak since he chose silence over my dignity at the dining table. I didn't flinch. I didn't soften. I met his gaze with the same flat, cold objectivity he had offered me on Thanksgiving. I was no longer his mother. I was the head of a major organization, and he was an individual who had legally acknowledged assaulting me. "Mr. Hayes," I corrected him, using the formal address. "This is a professional setting. If you wish to donate to the foundation, please speak to Dr. Reed or Elias Thorne." The formality stung him. He looked away, then back at me, his eyes pleading. "I lost my job, Mum. The firm couldn't take the PR hit. Brittany left last month. She blamed me for losing the estate and the trust money. I have nothing left." I listened without interruption, without a change in expression. This was the consequence of his actions, the cold, practical outcome of his greed. I had achieved the equilibrium Walter had always sought, consequences matching intent. "That is unfortunate, Jason," I replied, my voice measured. "But those are the inevitable outcomes of the choices you and Brittany made when you physically removed me from my home and attempted to accelerate your inheritance through intimidation. You signed a legally binding acknowledgement of your actions. You received the full legal consequence of your intent." He took a step closer. "It was a mistake. I was pressured. I didn't mean to lose you. I just want a chance to apologize, to rebuild." A raw, bitter memory flashed through my mind. Jason, age 8, holding my hand after breaking a vase, his eyes full of genuine remorse. The memory was painful, but it was just a memory, unconnected to the man standing before me. "Apology is an emotional transaction, Jason," I said, maintaining my distance. "And our emotional ledger is closed. I have moved past that. I took the pain and built this." I gestured around the elegant, bustling office. "This foundation is my purpose now. Your mistake has become the genesis of a positive legacy that will serve hundreds of people you will never meet. The $900,000 you paid in restitution is already out there, saving other families from your kind of self-serving exploitation. You have paid for your autonomy, and I have paid for mine." He looked deflated. "So there's no forgiveness?" "Forgiveness is for the self, Jason. I have forgiven myself for trusting you. That is my peace. I do not need to forgive you to be whole. And legally, our separation is permanent and sealed. You may not contact me again, except through Elias Thorne. If you need support, I suggest you seek counseling. The foundation does not provide resources for the perpetrators of elder abuse." It was ruthless. It was clinical. It was the absolute, unyielding boundary that a lifetime of practical experience had taught me was necessary for survival. I watched the last spark of hope leave his eyes. He realized then, fully, that he hadn't just lost an inheritance. He had lost the unconditional structure of my love, and that structure was now irrevocably closed off. He nodded slowly, defeated. He turned and walked out of the office, melting back into the anonymous, busy street of downtown Seattle. That was the last time I ever saw him. The years that followed were the most fulfilling of my life. The Hayes Autonomy Foundation flourished. We expanded our reach, opening satellite offices in California and New York, taking on complex, precedent-setting cases. My story, stripped of sensationalism and presented as a narrative of resilience and legal empowerment, became the backbone of our educational outreach. I never became cynical about people. I simply became fiercely protective of boundaries. I fostered new relationships with the foundation staff, with the fellow board members, and with the hundreds of seniors we successfully helped reclaim their lives, their homes, and their dignity. I saw in their triumphant, newly independent faces the reflection of the woman who was pulled from the Thanksgiving table and refused to be silenced. I often returned to the theme of legacy. Walter's legacy was the financial structure. Mine was the emotional and legal structure, built atop his. Together, Our estate had been redeemed from the hands of greed and consecrated to a higher, measurable good. The true moment of release came not when Jason signed the papers or when he walked out of my office, but 3 years later, during a quiet moment alone in my small, elegant apartment overlooking the Sound. I was working late on a speech detailing the Foundation's long-term goals. I looked down at my left wrist. The bruise from that Thanksgiving was long gone, of course, but the memory was sharp. I closed my eyes and allowed myself, for the first time in years, to truly feel the pain of that initial betrayal. The shock, the cold air, the clatter of the silverware, the shame. I felt the immense wave of grief wash over me. The grief for the loss of the idea of a family, for the decades I had poured into raising a son who could discard me for convenience. I let myself weep, not for pity, but for the depth of the loss. And then, as suddenly as the grief came, it receded. What remained was not emptiness, but a quiet, powerful light. I had done everything right. I had raised him with love, provided him with structure, and taught him the value of honesty and hard work. His failure was not a reflection of my parenting. It was a reflection of his own inherent greed, a choice he made as an adult. I had been dragged down to the floor, but I had used the law to stand up, dust myself off, and walk a new path of purpose. I realized that my own forgiveness was not about excusing Jason. It was about absolving myself of the burden of his failure. I was not the victim of his actions. I was the architect of my own recovery. The final piece of the U-shaped journey, the rebirth, was complete. My scar remained, but it had healed into a source of wisdom. I learned that the greatest betrayal is not what others do to you, but what you allow yourself to do to your own spirit in response. I had refused to wither into bitterness. I used the pain of abandonment to fund and fuel a mission that would outlive the memory of the betrayal. True liberation is finding a purpose so profound, so vital to the community, that the injury becomes merely a powerful anecdote, a necessary first chapter to a much larger, more significant story. My life was no longer about securing my past. It was about structuring a future of autonomy and dignity for myself and for countless others. I transformed the shame of being pulled from a chair into the dignity of standing on a platform, teaching the world how to fight back.